Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest from the COVID inquiry as the chief scientific advisor to the government at the time, Professor Patrick Vallance, gave evidence which showed Boris Johnson to be someone who, far from following the science, as he insisted, did not even understand the basics. He has a few insights about Dr. Death, aka Rishi Sunak, as well. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So Boris Johnson and his government insisted that they followed the science at all times during that critical period in 2020. Absolute rubbish is what the COVID inquiry are hearing, and it is no surprise to those of us who have a bit of a scientific background who observed everything in 2020. And when it comes to the evidence of Sir Patrick Vallance, who's Johnson's chief scientific advisor, we've got some really useful insights because Vallance was in the habit of keeping a diary of his role in the affair. So in meetings, he would write things down. Sometimes later on after meetings, he would write things down. Not in order to publish it later, he said, but as a way of focusing his own thoughts. Now, before I go over some of the evidence from today, being fair, it's worth beginning with one very important thing that Vallance said today. He told the inquiry that it was not unusual for politicians to have a poor grasp of science worldwide. And this is absolutely true. I would certainly not have expected Boris Johnson or indeed any Prime Minister, even a credible one, to have anywhere near even my level of understanding of the science of COVID, much less that of the leading experts. Politicians rarely come from a scientific background. The politician who can understand exponential growth or have an appreciation of risk management, it's a rare beast. And you see it everywhere in politics. Politicians rarely come from scientific backgrounds. Political commentators, likewise, political journalists. I'm highly unusual in being from, being a political commentator with a scientific background. Like when I say I used to be a teacher, people assume, what did you teach? Politics or history? No, science and maths. So sure, we couldn't expect Boris Johnson to be a scientific expert or even adept. But I would add a couple of further things. The first is that listening and reading the evidence from today, Boris Johnson was particularly poor at grasping scientific concepts. In fact, when I noted on it on Twitter, someone did respond to me saying, you might need to take account of the fact that he's also a high-functioning alcoholic as well. That affects memory. Sure, yeah. So even for a politician, Johnson was potentially particularly bad at being able to understand the discussions upon which he was deciding policy. Second thing to note is it's understood that politicians need not actually be experts in anything, never mind just science. Most politicians don't know anything about anything, not to any great degree. This is why they have access to expert advice. They're supposed to take that advice. It's one thing to say, it's politicians who decide policy. Yes, it is, absolutely. But it is completely reckless to pursue policies for a deadly pandemic, real serious national emergency, against the advice of your scientific experts. For example, we found a couple of weeks ago that he refused to believe in the concept of long COVID. That is not simply a consequence of his lack of clinical understanding. That is a consequence of his arrogance in thinking that his below average scientific understanding can dismiss information from a leading expert. So this idea that most politicians are not scientists is not a defence in Johnson's case. He overruled scientific advice and he must answer for the consequences of doing so. In terms of the evidence, Vallance's diaries had multiple references to the fact that Johnson would have something, I would say, is fairly basic explained to him. He'd hold it in his head for a short while and then it would be gone, not just like weeks later. You'd expect that, like the next day. Even when he could show some dim understanding of a concept, he was simply unable to retain the knowledge for long enough to make a decision. And when you think that Johnson wasn't just having meetings with scientific experts, he was having meetings with political advisors, being bombarded by the likes of Dominic Cummings and others. And Johnson's limited intellectual capacity really wasn't going to be up to the job of deciding a useful strategy. Dominic Cummings described Johnson as the trolley for his habit of veering one way and then another. But, you know, Cummings was one of the people who contributed to that. In one extract from Valence's diary, he says, and I quote, "Watching PM get his head around stats is awful. He finds relative and absolute risk almost impossible to understand." Now, I remember talking about this very thing a lot in 2020 because it was absolutely essential. An understanding of the nature of risk was absolutely essential in forming policy. And it was clear to me at the time that this simply wasn't being applied at all because the government were not presenting public health messages that allowed people to recognise the nature of risk. Like, you would have stupid things said in the papers, just like, "Oh, what do you want to do? Never go out again." It's like, no, it's about managing risk. Every time you go out and do a thing that puts you at a certain level of risk, just limit the number of times you do it. Even this is outside of lockdowns, of course. Limit. So if you're going to go to the cinema, if you're going to go to a restaurant, just reduce the number of times. And they would just behave as if, oh, well, if you do it once, you might as well do it every day. No, what? Do you understand nothing of risk? No, apparently not. You know, without the benefit of the insights coming out of this inquiry, I knew at the time that the government weren't following the science. It was obvious to anyone with any level of scientific understanding. But as well as describing how it seemed impossible to get Boris Johnson to understand the scientific issues at the time, Valence also presented evidence which we have seen from other quarters as well, which showed that Johnson was always looking for ways to justify sticking with his ideological instincts to do nothing at all. In Valence's notes, which were taken either at the meeting or noted down on the day of the meeting, so it was always fresh in his mind, he quoted Johnson as describing those who would die as a result of his policies as, "Oh, well, they've had a good innings." Now, again, it's treating those at risk as being just those who've lived a long life, when there were younger people with medical issues at severe risk as well. But even for these older people, who were, you know, the people who were mostly actually dying, yeah, sure. This was Boris Johnson saying it was acceptable that any number of them could die if it made it easier for him to make decisions. Because this was Boris Johnson at his most obviously unfit for office. Unprepared to make difficult decisions or to communicate the situation to the public, he reverted to the path of least resistance, as any chancer with a privileged upbringing would do. And the path of least resistance was to justify to himself and others that the elderly had not, they no longer had the right to life. So they were expendable. You know, that the right to life for these people was a privilege. Well, not really a right. It was that above a certain age, it was a privilege. And that particular reference was during the period when Johnson was resisting the second lockdown. This was like in the summer or late summer. This was the lockdown which became necessary as a result of Dr. Death, the Chancellor's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, to which Valence expressed surprise that Sunak and the politicians who drove that scheme should have thought that scientists would have approved it. They didn't ask them. I mean, consider we've already heard that Sunak formed this scheme without seeking scientific advice. Didn't even ask, didn't even say to anyone, "Oh, is this a good idea?" Because he knew what the answer would be. The answer would be, no, of course not. Like, even someone like me knew that the scheme was insane. It wasn't a way to help hospitality industries out. What they needed was like money to keep them going. It specifically excluded those who do takeaways, which was a much safer way of keeping those businesses going. I think there was one exception. I think there was one restaurant chain that donated to the Tories that got included. But it was essentially a scheme which involved getting people from different households to an indoor location, usually poorly ventilated, where wearing masks was not at all feasible. Because you'd be eating and drinking, can't wear a mask. So if you wanted to actually drive a second wave, kill a load of people, and of course then need a second lockdown, Eat Out to Help Out is the way you would do it. If you ask for someone's advice, "Oh, I actually want to drive a second wave, how should I do it?" Well, encourage loads of people to go to restaurants. Sunak created the conditions for the second wave, and Johnson made sure that it killed as many people as possible before taking action. That goes beyond the consequences of politicians not having a scientific background. This is politicians being actively anti-science, refusing to get the advice of scientists for a COVID scheme, and when they get that advice anyway, ignoring it. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time. I'll see you later.